So man, it just posted the dorkiest tweet on my thing. Welcome to our live show. It says. Hold on, I'm gonna repost it. Um, okay. Do you have a spicy headline we should use?
That's
The
your job,
end
isn't
of.
it?
I guess I'm not very good at the end of blockchain or something. Something about something catastrophic, some paradigm shift that is so catastrophically revolutionary.
Well, I think one of the theses, which is not necessarily unique to us, but a big piece of it is, Cross talks about this a lot as well, but it's like end users should not be using kind of like there's like bridges, and then I would categorize these like intent-based bridges. It's still called bridges, just from a user experience. It feels like a bridge, but it's more like a fast liquidity layer. Um, and this idea that that is all that users will ever use, and then the bridges become like the wholesale rebalancing um, networks. Um, but yeah, that's kind of the thesis where the UX, the cost will always be better um, from these fast liquidity networks, and yeah, looking using a bridge will kind of seem antiquated.
Intents are the end of blockchain UX or something like this.
Mm,
Intents,
I
not
don't know.
blockchains. Nah, I don't know.
Well,
It's too hard.
blockchain. Yeah, I mean, certainly another piece for us is just like an every chain focus. I think, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of talk of chain abstraction, and that is definitely a piece of what we're kind of working towards. Um, but it's also, I don't know, like the UX that we have today is not actually that different. Like you still have to submit your own transactions. So ironically, we got there's actually arguments of like I don't know, like are intents and relay actually intents in the like traditional sense of like an off-chain signed order and then someone else executes your transaction? Because for both of us today, the user is still having to make their own transaction. They're paying gas, um, and that's actually the UX hasn't changed necessarily.
I guess
It's
there's
just way
a
faster and
limit
cheaper.
order, or it's not even a limit order. It's an order. It's an order
It's a
that's
market order,
processed. It's a market order,
is
but it's
one of the ways we
processed
talk about it.
as long as it's valid. It's processed immediately. Or is there a mempool of them until the relayer
No,
decides to pick one up?
you're just pushing it on chain. So like yeah, actually we started from a chain abstraction kind of perspective, and then we still think that's coming, but it's a lot further down the line. And people still have EOAs, they still make their own transactions. And the really pressing need today is just like helping them do that on many chains as quickly and cheaply as possible. But the same infrastructure that lets these users that have EOAs and know 30 different chains, the same thing that helps them bridge quickly is what will abstract the chains down the line. This like mysterious solvers kind of like abstracting which USDC you have it across different chains. Well, in order for that illusion to maintain, you just need incredibly fast, incredibly cheap cross-chain liquidity. So I think we're like still in the phase one of we're not abstracting chains yet, where very clearly people know what chains they're using, they know where their money is, uh, but it's just better bridging. But the infrastructure for better bridging is what will bring that future eventually, because and in many ways it'll come from new users. I think it's really hard to migrate existing users to kind of go set up a completely different wallet. There's also downsides to smart accounts and these pieces. So it's like a much longer time horizon, but it I don't know how closely you're looking at the resource lock sort of
Yeah,
ideas.
Stefan
Um,
Gosselin was on the show talking about one balance, and I imagine I don't know what else is in that part of the landscape, what the alternative visions are around that, but yeah, credible commitment machines where essentially you lock assets, and then you need to lock the assets because you need to know what is it like the solvers or whatever the relayers. You need to be sure that the assets were not spent before you commit to acquiring some assets on their behalf or paying gas for something, right?
yeah, it's pretty simple. In these models, you're paying on chain A to do something on chain B, and the like default model is, well, I'm going to wait till I see that payment land on chain A, and once I've seen that the payment's landed, I'll do the thing on chain B because I'm confident I got paid. And so the alternative is if they just have their money locked on chain A and then they sign a commitment to give me money in a way that they can't back out of, like they can't just like send a separate transaction that it, spends the money, then I don't need to wait for any kind of blockchain finality on chain A. I can instantly kind of execute on chain B and come back and get the money. So that is like that makes a ton of sense that that will be the future for a lot of applications. But it's quite a shift for people to move all their money into these like escrowed accounts. And to be honest, some people won't want to do it, right? Because you basically you've got a cosigner on every transaction you're doing because that cosigner is making sure. Now the cosigner could be like a TEE, but and there's like a way that if the cosigner is like griefing you or unresponsive, you can like exit and maybe it takes 24
Can,
hours and you can
can the
get your money out of the lock.
cosigner be a module in a safe? Does it need to be as bad as a
Um,
TEE? Can it be something more legit?
it
It
kind
can
of
be any.
has to be something off chain in a way. Otherwise, you lose the benefit. It could be a separate chain, but it needs to be like um, it needs to be decoupled from kind of where they have their money, or then you lose the speed benefit, right? Because the point is every time the user signs, you've got to like they first put their money in the resource lock, and then they're spending bits of money that's in the lock. And every time they like say, I want to spend something, you kind of need to put it aside for that kind of spend request.
Right.
And so somebody so another project in the space is Uniswap have this thing called the Compact, which is Zero Age's creation from who did Seaport. And in the compact, it's called like the allocator. So you put your money in a resource lock, and somebody needs to be, allocating your balance and making sure you don't double spend it. And that could be a blockchain somewhere. It could just be a server. It could be a TEE, some sort of MPC network. But there needs to be something that's making sure you don't double spend it, and you want it to be faster than the chain the money's on. Otherwise, you might as well just kind of pay with your money on that chain. And usually the idea is you can keep your money in one place. And you don't have to have it everywhere. Like a little bit of money on every chain. So anyway, that stuff is coming.
Does that
Yeah.
mean that the cosigner is at the end of the day, like you can move the relayer around, but at the end of the day, there is a relayer that assures the credible commitment, and so ultimately, it is still a cross-chain problem. It's just been renamed as a whatever cosigner credible commitment, a guarantor. But I thought there was a way to do credible commitments that are. I thought 4337 was like an alternate at the time was like an alternative to the TEE or what have you. But I guess it's just by way of an off-chain signer co-signer.
It can. Yeah. I mean, you can do a fully on-chain version of it, and you I think it kind of comes down to speed, where and the whole point, like the whole one balance thing, is the guarantee. Blockchains give you guarantees, and so normally, when someone pays on chain A to do something on chain B, chain A is the one like giving a guarantee that you've been paid. And so one of the goals with the resource locks is to kind of like decouple the guarantees from any given chain, to something that's maybe faster and can give out these instant guarantees that, okay, yes, the money won't be double spent, even if that money is on a chain like Ethereum where you can equivocate. So it's like
Right.
you kind of
Equivocate.
like, rather than having the money on Ethereum and then the guarantees on Ethereum, and if you're getting guarantees on Ethereum, you have to wait for Ethereum to finalize before those guarantees are done. You can kind of have the money on Ethereum, but then do guarantees in a TEE, in a faster blockchain, in kind of a separate system, while still keeping the money like fairly secure on Ethereum, but you can kind of give out faster guarantees, basically.
So I think you kind of touched on. By the way, this is Peter for anyone watching. uh, Peter did Reservoir, which many people know from various integrations as an NFT order book that aggregated all NFT or a great deal of NFT liquidity across various platforms. Correct?
Correct. Yeah, a bit of aggregation, and then effectively an order book that anyone could build a marketplace on top of. So now kind of powering Magic Eden's EVM marketplaces, a
Oh
bunch
well.
of the kind of standalone ones like Proof of Plays, Pirate Nation, Highlights, secondary trading. So yeah, a lot of the secondary trading you can kind of build marketplaces on top of that. In addition to accessing NFT liquidity anywhere. So if you're minting NFTs in Warpcast or something like that, it's probably us under the hood kind of figuring out how to execute that mint.
Kind of definitive secondary liquidity aggregator API in EVM, right? I don't.
Right. Kind of like 1inch 0x equivalent in the NFT world.
But then you've had this second act, relay.link, which I use all the time. But I do so without deeply understanding the security model. And I do so even though I don't deeply understand the security model because it's atomic. And so at most I'll lose whatever's in that one transaction. I suppose, or an allowance, I guess you could worry about perhaps. But if you keep your allowances safe. Um, but I use Relay all the time. Relay also powers Rainbow's swaps, correct?
Bridges, at least at this point.
Yeah, sorry, bridges. I mean, yeah, yeah. Apologies. Yes, bridges, and I guess they bundle swaps with the bridges. But in any case, are there any other places where it's integrated that people might be surprised to hear about?
All of the cross-chain minting in Zora is us. So if you kind of want to mint with any other um,
That works
token,
great,
we
by the way.
do
I love that. You mint with
we
your ETH
we
balance on one chain, and it's work right in the Zora interface. It's a great integration.
a lot of chains we're kind of powering the instant bridging functionality. So I think even today, Eclipse went live with their bridge interface. You can either use the canonical rollup bridge or there's an instant tab now, and that will use us under the hood. So instant depositing or withdrawing to rollups is a big use case. Also to apps. So within Privy, if you onboard into a new app via Privy, you can onboard via a credit card. But if you want to onboard with on-chain balance, that will use Relay to kind of try and pull that from wherever it's available, whether that's another EVM chain or it's Solana or Bitcoin. Um, and that's kind of an increasingly common use case is kind of like cross VM. EVM chains trying to attract Solana users and vice versa. Um, and so, yeah, the two very notable things about us are the kind of fast and cheap, but then also very broad network support with the goal of just effectively supporting everything.
Yeah, because you mentioned Solana, and I think people may be surprised at that. Can you just give people for people who haven't used it, um, let's say I want to move USDC from I don't know, base to Zora. How long might that take, and how much might that cost? Like in a typical scenario,
That
or
it
to
should take
OP or some other chain,
a
any chain.
couple of seconds, and it will cost about 2 BPS. So that's if you're sending $100, that's like 20 cents, or is it 2 cents? Pretty cheap, and yeah, it effectively works by you have these fillers or relayers or solvers the words are kind of used interchangeably, that already have money ready to go on the destination where you're trying to get to. And you basically say, I'll pay you on base if you kind of execute a transfer for me. So that's either just send me money, but it could actually be execute a call. So that's how the Zora mints work, is that the filler actually goes and mints on your behalf. Uh, and but mints with you as the recipient. Um, and so you can basically execute any arbitrary transaction on another chain and then pay for it wherever you have money.
Amazing.
Um,
I guess there's some that makes me think of it some kind of edge case where like you're not the minter on the destination chain; it's some relayer.
yeah, it is an interesting. It's an interesting thing. There, a lot of the use cases to buy things you can buy on someone else's behalf. So you can buy a token and deliver to them. You can mint an NFT. Sometimes there are restrictions around kind of like one per minter, or a white list of who can mint. And that said, there are solutions to that. One is kind of with smart accounts, the relayer could execute a user op that is authenticated as the user. And so like, and that will be increasingly common and doable in a world of 7702, where you can kind of turn an EOA into a smart account. So it is a limitation, but it'll be an increasingly less common limitation. And then I think the second part is a lot of the time that you want speed, uh, is that you're like buying something versus selling. The sort of actions that are authenticated actions, like selling or like voting
Hmm.
in something or playing your game, might be kind of less urgent when you're looking to tap into this liquidity layer. So they're the kind of like two counters to the fact that it is a problem, but it's less of a problem than you might think.
That's interesting. So, okay, let's walk through the life cycle of a transaction. Maybe we could even do a spicy one, like I have ETH on base, or I have USDC on base, and I want to mint a NFT on Solana. Is that conceivable?
Yeah, I mean, it's all kind of the same thing. It basically comes down to input token, output token, and then calls you want to execute it. And basically everything can be framed in these things, right? Even a transfer is just the input token and the output token are the same, and they're on the same chain. A bridge is just same input token, same output token, but chains are different and no calls. A mint is okay, cross chain with a mint. We also support same chain. So like, let's say it's a mint in ETH, but you want to pay for it in USDC. That is just USDC input, ETH output, then this call executed. So you can kind of frame everything, swaps, bridge, kind of cross chain calls in these like three pieces. And so that's the idea, that you just have liquidity everywhere. You have these fillers ready and available, and then users can kind of interact with blockchains as if it was just like one thing. And funnily enough, like there's some parallels to what we were doing as an aggregator in NFTs, where there was many marketplaces, and it was like, how can we abstract the marketplaces so that I just see some NFTs, I want to buy them. I don't care that this is listed in an order book on OpenSea or it's actually in an NFTX AMM. All of that is like not relevant to me. I just want to like interact with like a simplified, abstracted layer. And so it's kind of a similar idea, but applied to how you interact with blockchains, which is like, this is what I want to do, and this is how I want to pay. And kind of the fact that they're on completely different chains, you just try and make that kind of no longer the user's problem.
And so the way that you do that is with this having relayers post a bond, and then offer to satisfy the claims. Maybe you can walk us through that.
Yeah, I think it's useful to start with like the very like classic intent flow. And so when people talk about intent-based bridging, what they usually mean is, okay, so the user wants to pay on chain A for someone else to do something for them on chain B. And so what before that filler, because the filler basically spends their own money on the destination. So the filler wants to make sure they're going to get paid. So what will normally happen is first the user locks their money in escrow, and the filler kind of waits for inclusion or a block or two of to see that, okay, I've been paid, or like at least the money's been put aside. Now I can go send money, execute a transaction. Um, and then once that's done, they kind of bring back proof that they filled in order to collect their payment. And there's variations of this. It could be optimistic. So they just like, they might come back and say, I filled, but they don't actually bring a proof. And if it times out, then they get their money. Across does like a batch fill where like all the intents across the whole system are kind of like settled at once, kind of every hour. One of the kind of problems with this is you in all of those models, it kind of there's a few factors, right? There's like, what is the gas involved with all of these pieces? And so, like, for example, the user's paying, they have to send money to a contract, state has to get updated to lock the money. Someone's going to have to come back and do a different transaction to unlock the money. Potentially, the money is going to sit there in the contract for some time period. So, in a cross, it's an hour or two before you actually get paid. So, as a filler, your kind of capital efficiency can be reduced by the fact you're not getting paid immediately. So there's all these like different factors to try and optimize for. And what we do differently is basically instead of, because at the end of the day, you've got these two actors that don't trust each other, the user and the filler. And so, someone's going to have to kind of lock some money before the other one feels safe kind of interacting with them. And so we kind of flip it. And the filler is the one that kind of locks a bond. And then the user, and so the filler locks a bond kind of like in advance, and that bond is kind of shared across all the order flow that they're filling. And the filler then kind of signs a commitment for the order. So the filler basically says, if you pay me on chain A, I will do this thing on chain B. And if they don't do that, then there's like an arbitration process where you can slash the filler and get their bond because they committed to something that they didn't do. And so then what's
Sorry,
different
and,
about
and that arbitration process is settled by them bringing proof ultimately, or failing to bring proof and being slashed?
So our system's like very optimistic. So the idea is like, once the user has the commitment, which is a fully just off-chain signed message, the user can just send money straight to the filler. So that's the first kind of major difference, is that the gas on the origin chain for us is a lot less because we don't have to send it into a contract and then have a separate transaction later to come unlock it. They just pay direct to the filler, and it's going to effectively be a transfer that's as close to like 21,000 gas as possible, which is like really important on Ethereum, which ironically is like becoming a problem again. Ethereum gas is like back on the radar. And then likewise, on the destination, the filler can just execute the transaction, and they don't have to necessarily route it through a particular protocol specific contract, because in other systems, you need to emit an event and prove that it was filled. And basically, we kind of have more of an optimistic off-chain process where in the event that the user paid and the filler filled, everyone's happy, like you just kind of move on. And no additional actions are taken. And so it's extremely efficient. And then in the unhappy case where like the user paid but the filler did not fill, then you can go through this process to kind of like say, well, here's their commitment, here's my payment, here's all, you bring all the proof, and there's this off-chain proving system to kind of say, oh yeah, the filler did not fill, and it's like a back and forth. And then the user can effectively slash the filler and get their
but essentially
bond.
the user can interact directly with the contracts to have the filler slashed if they don't come back with proof that they did it.
And there's pieces we're working on to potentially allow that to the user to not need to worry about that. So you can imagine like anyone else could buy out the user's claim. So the user, from their perspective, they kind of just got paid. Like it feels like they got paid or refunded, but it actually kind of resulted in a process to go slash
someone collecting fees on the slashing.
What's that?
Someone collecting fees when successfully.
Yeah, there would be a reward for kind of like bringing the slashing case. And so I think the main takeaway is like that kind of like slashing process is actually quite complicated. And so we optimize for the happy case and make that as efficient, as clean, as simple as possible. And we were talking earlier about like the UX as well. Like it's pretty nice to just send a transfer, which is very relevant with the ERC20 tokens, where normally you have to do an approval and then call a contract that's going to pull them out of your wallet. But with Relay, you can just transfer the ERC20 token to initiate.
Very cool. Very cool.
Unique.
That's always felt so silly. Yeah.
And these things are all kind of possible, but then you have this complexity underneath. Like one of the the goal is to shift the complexity to the professional actors, the fillers, maybe the kind of watchers that are kind of making sure that the system is running properly, and have as little complexity for the users as possible, and optimize the UX for them. So yeah, I think to summarize, there's a whole category of intent-based bridges, and we are in that category, and all of them achieve kind of that result of really fast and cheap transfers by leveraging fillers. And then within that category, Relay tries to be the most efficient version of that. Basically, how can we take this to the extreme, reduce the costs as much as possible so it works for really tiny values, such as like minting a $1 NFT, or even just paying to execute the gas, where it might be like sub cents that you're trying to execute something on a different chain. You need as little overhead for that to work as possible. And the last thing, one of the last nice advantages, which fits into the Solana and Bitcoin stuff, is that because we shift a lot of the validation off chain and avoid using smart contracts on the origin and destination chains, that is one of the reasons we can go to Solana and Bitcoin quickly, because the actual like it's mostly just transfers on those chains with a little bit of metadata in the transfers, and then all the complexity is off chain. So that is kind of like why. And by the way, that was like a deliberate design decision of like, how can we make this as easy as possible? If there's going to be 1,000 chains and people are going to want to use all different chains, how do you kind of build it and design it in a way that you can bring it to these chains, whether that's alternative VMs or the thousandth roll up. And so that's like another big focus.
But there is a process to the off-chain adjudication and optimistic process, or the optimistic off-chain adjudication process can be adjudicated even if the data provenance is from different chains. Like, can the slashing be done permissionlessly? Ultimately, can the slashing be done permissionlessly if the data to prove or disprove the transaction is like Bitcoin data?
Yeah, you just need like an agreed upon way of, and we have this thing, this verifier node, and all that does is kind of say, given a commitment, which is just like a signed order, and given a couple of transactions, the verifier just needs to know how to call like a Bitcoin node, for example, and verify, given this transaction hash, was a particular payment made from A to B, and a certain metadata was included there. So anyone can kind of run this software and kind of spit out the output of like, yes, this commitment was either adhered to or it wasn't adhered to. So every new VM we go to, we do have to build a new module in the verifier to be able to understand if Bitcoin orders were successfully done or Solana orders were successfully done. So it's not like, you can just arbitrarily roll it out, but it is nice to kind of minimize some of the complexity. And then the other thing, you made a point like really early in like the first sentence around the risk. Your risk, one of the interesting things about these intent-based bridges is that it's not resulting in you holding some wrapped asset, right? And like when you've got a wrapped asset like that got bridged, then like just holding that asset at any time, something could go horribly wrong, and WBTC or whatever it is, like it could all the Bitcoin could get stolen from the reserves, and you're left holding this like empty representation of the asset. So one of the nice things about intent-based bridges, and by the way, it's not just intent-based bridges, like there's almost like classes, like even something like Stargate. At the end of the Stargate bridge, you get regular ETH or regular USDC, and so that's kind of one of my advices that I give kind of chains and asset issuers of like, how can you, like from a user perspective, you want to avoid global risk, which is like the whole asset at any point, anyone holding it is like is at risk if some validator set gets compromised, to like, how can you, maybe only have a small amount of risk during that process of moving it, and still have like strong guarantees. But then once you get the money on the other side, like you're in the clear. There's no Relay could get hacked, and unless you were in flight, you're kind of completely safe. So I think that's like a good principle to look for in bridge designs.
Yeah, that's why I trust it. And even without understanding deeply the implications, anything atomic, I feel is just so much more. I even use atomic off ramps sometimes, where like they don't hold assets. Like at worst,
Yeah,
you lose the one transaction.
yeah, and you see people actually send like a little bit at a time. And funnily enough, I believe this is the design of Ripple, is it's just
Hmm.
sending constant tiny little packets of money so that if for whatever reason trust is broken, like the actual loss is incredibly small. It's like similar to internet packets. Like apparently Ripple is actually like pretty cool technology.
Interesting. I'm curious about it now. But
But
they don't have like a global sequential state. Like there was some
I don't know
notion of
all the
something being
stories. All
lost
I
in
know is that it's
flight.
kind of this
Okay.
idea of effectively like
Okay.
streaming
We'll have to
money.
get someone
But
on from
it's like
Ripple.
it's one way to get security is to just send a little bit at a time. Okay, that one got there. I'll send a bit more, and so like my absolute total potential loss is like one packet. Um, and so
I was
again,
amazed to
like
see,
this is
didn't Mount Gox just move like 2.6 billion dollars worth of Bitcoin in one transaction? I find that amazing that people pull the trigger on that kind of transaction.
it is pretty wild. Um,
I don't know if
so
I would have the confidence to sign to click the. I would do it. I would break it up into at least two.
yeah, and by the way, like this is another part of the philosophy is like as you have increasingly consumer use cases, the size of the kind of amounts being transferred is smaller, right? There's still people doing, millions, and maybe those people should just use the canonical bridge and wait longer. Um, but when you have these like use cases, like I'm buying things, even you look at Solana meme coins and the like average size that people are doing is like quite small, and so you just don't maybe need the most insane iron grade security for kind of moving smaller amounts of money. And so like how could it's all trade-off spectrums. How can you optimize something for really good UX and consumer experiences?
What is a canonical bridge? I mean, are you talking about like the USDC native assets, for example, or are we talking about crypto
Yeah,
native
yeah.
assets?
I mean, like, so let's say you're on Base or any roll up, they all have a built-in bridge basically. And so the safest thing to do is bridge over the built-in bridge. But going from Base to Ethereum, that takes 7 days, and it takes 7 days because it's extremely secure, and it's leaving this really long kind of time period to make sure there was uh, no fraud. And then you have kind of people layering things on top of that, um, that are arguably less secure because they're involving kind of other third parties, and maybe the risk is not about losing money. It might be like a liveness risk of like, oh, my money's going to get tied up in some um, you know arbitration process. But yeah, I don't think there's like a single bridge design that will win for everything. I think there'll be this kind of spectrum of, if I'm sending $2.6 billion, I'm going to do it this way. If I'm minting a $2 NFT, I'm going to do it this way. Um, and so even our design, we don't think it is the best design for everything. It kind of works really well. Yeah, there's actually like when you're sending small amounts, every time like this that each filler has a bond, and like their bond is almost like a piece of their bond gets allocated to effectively ensure each order, and then when the order completes, then they can reuse it, right? And so it works really well for constant turnover of small orders. If someone wants to do $1 million order, you need like $1 million of bond kind of ready to go. And so our our plan is to whether to use create another kind of protocol ourselves or just use someone else that's built a more classic intent model where that $1 million should just get locked in escrow and not use the bond system and use a more traditional flow. And so the point is that we think like depending on the amount, depending on the route, you will use like different settlement methods. And Relay has come out and been like, how do we build the most extremely optimized settlement mechanism for these kind of lower value consumer use cases? And then at some threshold, you're just better off using a different method that locks the funds in escrows, sends back a proof message to say, yes, this was filled, unlock the payment. And then at the really extreme level, then maybe you should just use the built-in bridge for that chain, something like that.
Um, I have several questions for you. Um, so your plan is to basically offer, like, you'll just integrate anybody who's the best at different scale, or build it yourself if there is no truly smart solution, but you're focused first on these consumer scale transactions. Um, I guess I'm just curious about, there's this, it's not really related to exactly to what you said, but so much of the security of L2s is my impression is that so much of the security model of L2s in general is on the premise that the valuable assets originated on L1. But some of my favorite assets originated on L2. Um,
Yeah, if it was minted on L2, then like technically it's there's no escape hatch to L1 for an L2 minted asset. And likewise, if a third party bridge was used, you also don't get the security of the chain. So like on Ape Chain, for example, it's all OFTs on Ape Chain. And so the kind of roll up bridge is not actually securing any assets. It's all the kind of Stargate, I think, kind of
mm,
system is kind of like what ultimately secures those assets. So yeah, it's like the people think in terms of like, oh, this L2, how secure is the L2 in general? But it's actually kind of, it's like actually an asset by asset equation of how did this asset get to this chain? Was it created on this chain? Was it bridged over the canonical bridge? Any asset that's bridged over the canonical bridge is the one that inherits the security from L1, is kind of the story there.
could you just summarize the topography of the intent based systems? Like you mentioned these message based systems, and that relays different. Also, there's canonical bridges, which I suppose fit in here somehow. What are the different like sections of that circle that you described?
Yeah, there's a few layers. I'll see if I can do it off the top of my head, but basically, yeah, when you have an asset on, well, first of all, when you have L2s, they have this built-in bridge, and that is the bridge where the posting of the state roots is what effectively secures that bridge. And so when you can bridge assets from L1 to L2, and they will have that security. Even things like Polygon that aren't L2s kind of have a built-in bridge that is like maybe considered to be the, you know, it's more debatable, but like, but anyway, like any asset is, it's far more relevant. Like, how did this asset get here? Because similar, you can have an asset on Polygon that was either bridged over the Polygon bridge, and so it's basically the security depends on Polygon's validators, or it could be bridged over layer zero OFTs, and then it's like who is the validator set? So it's like you kind of have the core. Like who can mint this token, and then for USDC it's like Circle can mint this token. The Circle is the bridge, they are the ultimate security level. So it's like on a per asset basis, they kind of, there is like, how is this thing, what was used to bridge this thing? And then on top of that, you have um, different models for how you can kind of have liquidity on top. So you can have pools, and I mentioned this earlier. Like people often compare, contrast things like Stargate and things like Across, but both of them, you basically are getting the canonical asset. So when I bridge from Ethereum to Base with Stargate, Stargate has pools of ETH. Effectively, the ETH has already been bridged over to Base. It's ready to go. I give Stargate my ETH on Ethereum, and they give me some legitimate canonically bridged ETH on Base. And
How,
so that's,
what's their model for making sure that's a secure thing for them to do?
well, they're passing messages. So what's different about Stargate versus Intense, like Across, is Stargate's like a global system, and like every action, there is like a DVN, which is basically a set of, effectively a multi-sig that's signing off on every action. Um, and yeah, like Stargate acts as this global system. And one of the reasons that usually something like Across or Relay is faster than Stargate is you've got these individual actors, right? So Stargate wants to be really sure that kind of the payment on chain A happened before they unlock the money on chain B.
By
Whereas
basically
when you,
by in a centralized manner running nodes of both chains and waiting some number of block confirmations before releasing the assets on the destination chain.
well, there's a validator set. It's not, I don't know exactly how many,
Okay.
but everyone in the validator set has to agree that the thing happened on chain A, and they all sign off on it. And once they've all signed off on it, then you can get the money on chain B. And the difference with Across and Relay is you have all these actors that are kind of like all these fillers that are on their own, right? And the fillers are spending their own money. So one of the reasons Stargate has to be a bit more careful is because it's a global system. People have put money in the pool, so you better not mess that up because then all the LPs in the pool lose money. So they tend to go a bit slower. Whereas if you're a filler and you're using your own money, you can go really quick. Like you can wait no confirmations. You're like, oh, I see the transaction. I'm just going to go. Especially if you make it a race, right? So now you've got a market of fillers like racing with each other. Whoever does it first gets the fill. So that's how Across works, where like whoever's in first fills the order, and so these fillers are basically taking on the finality risk because it's like individual actors that are competing with each other versus a global system where they, you know, Stargate could go quick as well, but then there would be like globally inherited risk, or like all the LPs would take on that risk.
Because the funds are pooled and the validation is done in a centralized manner by a multi-sig or something, but ultimately it's
Yeah,
like
there's only
sequential.
one. You,
Yeah.
you can't in Across every validator effectively can set their risk tolerance differently. Some go
Mm.
fast, some are like, I'm going to wait 6 blocks before I try and fill this.
And it's a marketplace.
Whereas in Stargate, it's globally configured effectively. And so you have to be a bit more conservative. And so that's like what results in the speed difference effectively. There's actually like technically nothing stopping fast Stargate from going as fast as Across does. Maybe like if you've got 9 validators, you'd have to, you know, it might be slower to get all 9 of them to sign off, but it could theoretically be just as fast as Intense. And so like what ends up being the actual difference is a global system versus kind of individual actors that can all have different risk tolerance.
Got it. So Across basically turns Stargate into a marketplace for fillers with to take on the amount of risk that they individually think is worth the reward of winning
Yeah, so
the
instead of like a
fill.
homogenous pool, everyone puts their money in the pool, and that pool takes on a certain level of risk in terms of like fast filling. Uh, in something like Across or Relay, it's heterogeneous. Every filler using their own money and with their own risk tolerance. And if let's say a filler goes fills something really fast and there's a reorg on the origin and actually the payment never came, only that filler loses. No one else in that system kind of like loses. Whereas if that happened to Stargate, all the LPs would kind of absorb that loss. And so that's kind of the that's the main difference. Otherwise, they're effectively very similar, where you've got pools of capital on the destination ready to go. So really, the way to think about it is there's effectively only two models. One model is it's the built-in security of the token, and you're deciding like when to mint it on the destination. So that's like the and so that could be the canonical bridge. It could be Circle, you know, with their system. So they wait 20 minutes. The canonical bridge is 7 days when you're, you know, launching. That's also OFTs. It's like the built-in security of the token can decide how quickly. So when you have cross-chain tokens, they're deciding, oh, I see that, you know, someone burnt a token on chain A, and now we're going to mint a token on chain B. And so that has to be built into the token itself. And then on top of that, you have pool-based models. And so I would call intent-based bridges effectively pool-based models, but instead of shared pools, every filler just has their own pools of capital ready to go. And basically my biggest message to asset issuers is you can actually go really fast with the kind of like you can create an OFT and you can effectively make it instant between chains. But in
Sorry,
doing
what is
that,
an
you do
OFT? What is an OFT?
okay. So OFT is layer zero's omni-chain fungible token, I think. And all it means is in the same way that Circle, you know, USDC, basically Circle, you can burn USDC on one chain. And when Circle sees that, they'll be like, okay, Now I'm going to let you mint it on a different chain. And so basically, any token issuer can do the same thing. They can choose who their validator set is for the token, and they can make it multi-chain, where I burn it on one chain and I mint it on another chain. And by the way, that's the same thing happens when you use a roll-up bridge. You're just burning it on Ethereum, and then you're minting some on Base, and going in the other direction, you burn it on Base, and usually you have to wait longer before you can mint it again on Ethereum. I say burn and mint, but it's either burn and mint or it's like lock and mint. So yeah, the
Yeah.
one on Ethereum Base, you lock it on Ethereum, which lets you mint on Base, and then once you're done on Base, you kind of burn it, and now I can unlock my funds. So the point is, like, that's built into the token, and you can go fast if you want to. So you can have a token where I'm basically instantly I like burn it on one chain, I instantly mint it on the other chain. But in the event that something goes wrong, like the whole token takes on that like global risk basically. And so that's why
What do you imagine going wrong there? What's an example of going wrong? Like if some chain
what could
is
go wrong is you mint the token on chain B, but actually that transaction that on chain A got reorged, and so the burn never happened. So now the
Mm.
total supply is just higher, and it's really hard to undo that because maybe someone who got the tokens on chain B has already gone and sold them, and you're in a mess basically. And so that's why, like, at the core token level, you kind of want to go slow. You want to be really sure that you're not dealing with these sorts of situations. And that's what's nice about pool-based models on top, is you can put the risk in those pool-based models, and like intents are kind of almost like the riskiest model, the way you can like go to the extreme of you've got these fillers that are instantly using their own capital to fill. So what that allows you to do is the users can have a really good UX, fast bridging, thanks to kind of these fast liquidity layers on top. And then you can, in the core bridging of how the token gets bridged, keep that slow and secure, so that you're not introducing like global risk to all token holders, is kind of the story, if that makes sense.
Yep. Did we get through the whole topography, or were there more players? Or
Um,
also in terms of asset. Um, okay, little side quest. There's no difference between mainnet USDC bridged to Base, for example, and Base native USDC, but there are two icons in everything. But at the end
no,
of the
there
day,
is a
that's a very
difference
is there?
because, yeah, so this is kind of the difference is how did it get there,
Yeah.
right? One of them on Ethereum, I basically burnt my USDC. Circle saw that I burnt it, and Circle minted me a USDC token. The other one, I locked my USDC on Ethereum, and then the Base kind of canonical bridge saw that happened, and they minted me. But they're completely different tokens, and the security is based on the bridge. So one of them secured by CCTP,
Mm.
the other one secured by the Base bridge. And so they are different, and that's what I mean by like the built-in bridging security. I can also create my own USDC on Base and secure it every time I see a transaction happen. And obviously, you would not want to hold that one because the kind of core security of it is a lot lower.
So the
Um,
CCTP, the native ones are better than any bridged one, just
they're better
factually.
in part. I mean, arguably, yeah. I mean, because Circle kind of just controls the thing, then
Yeah.
if Circle has a bug, well, the whole thing's kind of screwed one way or the other.
Now, what's
But the
the
Circle one is
best?
faster, so that's why it's nicer.
But it's not as fast as Relay. It's quite slow relative to Relay.
It is. Yeah, it's 20 minutes or so.
Isn't that
Although, it
ridiculous?
depends on the chain.
Oh, I
So
guess
if you
just
go
because
from Solana,
they're waiting for confirmations, but they don't need to wait that long.
well, if it came from Ethereum, you do, yes. So that's where the 20 minutes comes from.
If it came from Ethereum, you need to wait 20 minutes confirmations.
You don't need to,
I
but
thought it
maybe
was
if you're
six
being like
blocks.
extremely paranoid, yeah, I don't know why it's 20 minutes. But then on the L2s, for some reason, they just set the time to the same as Ethereum, and they're apparently going to change that. They're kind of like they were just being paranoid. On Solana, it's like 10 seconds. So if you burn on Solana, you can mint on another chain 10 seconds
Isn't that weird? Isn't that unexpected? I would have thought Solana was less secure in this
Well,
fashion
Solana,
than.
I believe you get, you know, instant finality like once
Oh, really?
everyone
Okay, I
signs
didn't
off on it.
understand that. Yeah, I've yet to explore
Um,
that world. Okay, so the native assets are okay. They're faster than some bridges, but they're not as fast as Relay. But what about for a truly decentralized asset? Not to neg USDC, but something that is not linked to a centralized issuer off chain. Um, let's say you're issuing a token and you want it to be multi chain. What is the most pure, what is the best way to have a multi chain asset that has native versions of it, I suppose, on each chain? Do you need are we back to credible machines? Do we need an assuring party off
well,
chain?
one of my questions would be like, why does this need to be on many chains? In general, I think the main tokens that need to be multi-chain are like money slash collateral. Whereas most of the tokens are probably just fine living on
Hmm.
one um, chain. And then, yeah, I think you have two options. One is you mint it on Ethereum, and then every chain you want to bring it to, you use that chain's built in bridge. And that is kind of like the highest security bridge, and you just bring it to every chain. The problem is that, like that's, now it's like slow to get that asset on and off, but that's where something like Relay can come in and be like, okay, yeah, like hyper secure to move the chain, move the token by default, but then you can layer something like Relay on to make it faster. The other option is that you use something like Layer Zero, Wormhole, Hyperlane. They all have their own frameworks. You come up with your own validator set, and that validator set is the one that determines, when you can mint and burn it on different chains. So they're the two options basically, and but then the whole security of the token is effectively independent of the blockchains it's on. It all comes down to that validator set, who's in the validator set, and can they be compromised. And there's some pretty good validator sets, that, like the default layer zero DVN, and then, I think so. I think Stargate uses layer zeros, DVN. They call it DVNs, but in a way, it's like a fancy name for multi-sigs, where you can combine multiple of them. You're also going to have kind of state storage proofs of kind of like what happened on one L2. There's like some good stuff happening there. So
So
there'll
to
be
be able to
improvements.
access the state of a different L2 from your L2 via the L1, something like that.
Basically, yes, you can kind of build bridges on top of that, or yeah, zero knowledge proofs of what happened on chain A. So I think the proving is going to get better, but even take zero knowledge proofs. Like I think zk sync's at 1 day to withdraw off zk sync. That's going to get down. Proving is going to get faster, but like it might get, in the best case, like a couple of minutes, because it's also expensive to be posting proofs back to Ethereum of like everything that happened on zk sync. And so that's why we think there'll just always be value in this kind of fast liquidity layer on top, even as the actual underlying bridges get better. Um, and then
So,
the
so
question is, yeah,
sort of the UX dividend of an optimistic approach.
basically, and so that is why I think long term it won't make sense for users to use. You want extremely secure bridges, but users will never use them. The bridges just kind of like determine the kind of like baseline security of holding the asset. But then you'll have these fillers, and users will mostly interact with fillers to, really quickly and cheaply move between chains. And then the fillers themselves will use the bridges to rebalance their inventory. Um, is the thesis basically. And so you still want kind of secure bridges. You still want to get finality time of those bridges down, but they'll never get to instant basically. And so the vision is to have these like two layers. Like maybe the analogy is like the Swift banking network and then the credit card network, right? The credit card network allows you to instantly spend, and then there's like a settlement process kind of between Visa and banks and kind of stores, and that can be slower because it's an asynchronous process. And so it's similar for fillers. They're rebalancing their liquidity, they're proving that they filled orders, and they're going collecting their payments. All that can happen like in the background at a slower pace versus like the instant filling of orders.
So only assets that are trying to be money need to be truly universally multi-chain with a native
I think
asset.
so.
Okay.
Um, right? Like
And
why? Because generally speaking, if you have an asset spread across many chains and like I want to buy it, well, the liquidity is going to be worse if it's in many places versus just like the whole market is in this one place. And if you look at centralized exchanges, like it's a similar situation. Liquidity gets fragmented, but that's in part because maybe not everyone can access the same centralized exchange, or maybe you don't want there just to be one centralized exchange because the monopoly power. But I think with on-chain assets, like it's nice to have all the liquidity concentrated and everyone can tap into that same um, liquidity. And by the way, it's like similar. Like, why do I need an NFT on many chains? Like, it's pretty minimal use cases. One use case is just like maybe proving what you own and being able to build experiences around that. And you probably don't need to bridge the asset to do that. You can bridge some message that kind of gives proof of what you hold. So I think money is the main thing that you see bridged. And so when we kind of go into new chains, it's usually ETH and USDC. Um, by the way, when we say money, like I think there'll be many games that effectively have a native asset, like degen, right? So like degen is the currency of the degen economy, and so it's effectively used as money. Um, and whereas like uni token, it doesn't need to be bridged in many places. It's an asset. It's used for governance. Like, why do I want uni token on base as well? Um, so that's kind of the kind of core thesis. And by the way, it's part of how we design things, which is that we think there'll be many chains, and that's a good thing. There'll be assets on all of these chains, and it's actually fine for that fragmentation to happen. Like leave the assets and long tail state on all of the chains. It's great that you can kind of have expansion of state. You don't have to worry about noisy neighbor. You can do an app chain, whatever it is. But money is the thing that you're actually going to have to bring to all of these chains. And it kind of sucks to have your money fragmented across all of these chains. And I'm leaving a little bit of money in all of these chains. And so that's where the thesis of can I have money in one place and then like just in time bridge it to every chain to spend it. Um, and so yeah, we kind of like split things into these two categories of I say money, but I think it's like similar with like even something like WBTC. It's more like money or collateral. It's like something that those things can make sense to have on many chains. But if you just kind of got like a lot of assets, otherwise don't need to be bridged, basically.
so Relay Link or I call it Relay Link because that's just how I see it in my head. I guess you call it Relay more.
Just relay, but
Just Relay.
relay.link is good for the
uh,
marketing.
it's good. I like it. I see it as and its first success in the market, at least from my non-quantitative and purely anecdotal perspective, is that it's fast and cheap transactions, fast and cheap bridging, but actually it's not bridging. Actually, it's filling intent demand with likely native assets on the resulting chain because it's not a wrap. You don't need to wrap anything, and actually, it's in the end a Trojan horse for just general message passing between chains, which can obviate the need for bridging in the first place because you can simply pay on one chain and get outcomes on another chain without ever leaving the chain, which maybe again shifts the complexity to the, I guess, wealthier or more interested parties who are like the merchants, for example, who can receive the burden is on them to receive assets on whatever chain and then execute actions on other chains, even becoming maybe their own relayers, their own fillers, because they don't need to accept funds on the chain in which they're going to affect outcomes. They might prefer to even receive those funds on a different chain or be willing to receive them on different chains. But from the user's perspective, anyway, they don't need to worry about it.
Yeah, I think that's spot on in the sense of when we started Relay, it was like, oh, why bridging sucks? People shouldn't have to bridge. How can we solve bridging? And I think we'll get there. And this is where a lot of the chain abstraction stuff comes from, where I just want to have money in one place. either I'm able to just in time spend it on different chains, or I don't even realize there are chains. I'm spending it on assets, I'm spending it on actions. I think we'll get there, but it will very much be like new users that will live in that world. And I mean, funnily enough, when we started Relay, we truly did not even, wasn't even on our radar bridging. So we were working with Zora and helping them with their kind of cross-chain minting basically, and design something under extreme constraints of like has to be really fast, has to be really low cost. And they were like, can we use this for instant bridging on our chain? And it was like, I guess so. And that kind of like pulled us into thinking about bridging. And I think one of the lessons was like these transitions are slow. It's same with like smart accounts, right? Like I think smart accounts will get there, but like on what time horizon? And right now, a lot of the users still have EOAs. They still know about chains. They're still bridging, and you want to be careful about like just building for now versus where you want things to go. But one of the things for us is that both a chain abstracted world and an explicit bridging world, they need the same thing, which is just like extremely fast and efficient bridging. And so if we can build that for today's world and build up the infrastructure, build up the liquidity, build up the routes, because there are just like infinite routes in terms of not just the chains, but now I've, people aren't satisfied with just ETH on this chain. They're asking us, oh, can I have USDC and USDT and WBTC? And so suddenly your liquidity is very fragmented. And so how do you solve that? And so like, how can you get more fillers in? But even, for fillers, it's, you have all these challenges around where do I put my money? Which chain am I going to put my money on? I don't know where the demand is going to come from. And so we're looking into models around people LPing in pools and fillers borrowing from pools, these sorts of things. Like there's a few teams working on these sorts of things. Even Circle is kind of thinking about these things of, this is where you get into the resource lock. Some of these ideas. There's just so much work to do. One of the ways I explain it is chain abstraction is basically an illusion of like you want to be able to the user to not know that there's chains. They're just like, I'm buying this, I'm doing this action, I don't even know about chains. Well, that illusion will break if like they just lost 1% for some reason, or it took 4 hours. And so until the only way to achieve chain abstraction is to just build up the liquidity that is insanely fast, insanely cheap, insanely deep, so they can do large amounts, and insanely wide in that every possible chain and route is supported. So there's just a lot of work to do there in the current paradigm, and that will kind of like translate over to the new paradigm too.
LP or fillers in Relay are kind of like market makers, right? That's the closest role. I mean, they are market makers. They're not like market makers, but I'm
I think the
curious
one
if, yeah, go for it.
I'd say like one difference typically when people think of market makers, they're kind of like taking on price risk, right? They've got inventory in different currencies and they're setting prices and they're like, trying to buy and sell assets and deal with that price risk. Maybe one difference is that for a lot of fillers, when you're dealing mostly with bridging, it's the same asset. Just it's all about kind of like placement. Like where do I put the assets to make sure that the demand is when the demand comes, like I've got liquidity ready to go there, and how long is it going to take me to get it off there and move it back there? So it's like a problem that's mostly around like allocation and netting, and it's like, oh, if you have people going in opposite directions, you get a bit of a coincidence of wants of like, oh, I don't need to rebalance because I netted between people going in two directions. So how can I set my fees in order to incentivize organic netting and these sorts of things? So it's a little different to market making, but it's the same in the sense of you are effectively market making between ETH on chain A and ETH on chain B, but they happen to be kind of like worth the same thing, which in some ways makes it a little bit more accessible.
I'm curious about the convergence of the filler role with other roles in the ecosystem, be that validator, or it seems very likely market maker, um, and also bundler, and also sequencer. It feels like there will be some, and also block builder.
Yeah,
Um, Curious if you have
I
thoughts on
think
that.
right now a filler is kind of doing two things. One is like they need money, they're using their own capital to fill things, and B, it's DevOps basically. They're executing transactions, they're watching chains, they've got to be really fast, they've got to deal with failing RPCs and kind of fallback, and it's like kind of like an engineering challenge. And I think if anything, you'll start to see those decouple because not everyone's good at both of those things at kind of DevOps transaction execution and having money. And so I think the more that they can decouple, and you can have some people that like, I've just got money, I want to contribute money towards this system, but I don't want to run a filler and deal with any of that. Then that is kind of that will allow, I think, these roles to merge more.
And which ones in particular? Like, does someone who I had
Well,
last
yeah, I
week on the
mean,
show, I had Felix from co-founder of CowSwap, and there's something about what you're doing that's similar but different. How do you, I guess, what is the difference, or how do you see the similarity? Too difficult?
yeah, I mean, the biggest difference today, and it might not be a big difference for long, is that CalSwap is on one chain at a time, and so things are atomic.
Right.
Um, and and so generally, the kind of that's kind of thought of as more as solving, where you have these solvers that are mostly just like finding liquidity. So they have no inventory of their own, and they're finding liquidity in various AMMs and filling that. And so that's what I was getting out of like, whereas cross chain is non-atomic, and so that kind of just like uh, creates a different situation. It's hard to have actors that are just purely kind of routing versus like coupling the routing and their own inventory. And so yeah, I think these things will start to overlap. Where for cross chain, you'll find ways to decouple the roles, so you can effectively have someone who's mostly just solving and executing transactions and able to use like other people's liquidity. And yeah, I think you're already seeing it. CalSwap, 1inch, kind of all these things are going cross chain. So it's all intersecting. I think CalSwap, generally speaking, is kind of focused on larger value, and like, they run an auction, and it's like, how can we get the absolute best price? Everyone's basically bidding. We're finding kind of like the best bid, and then we're doing something, and that works really well for larger amounts. And actually, this is kind of the origin story of Relay, is that we designed a different protocol before this called MemSwap. We like announced it, we wrote up a ton of docs, but we never shipped it because um, basically the learning was like, yeah, we had all these fancy order flow auction designs, like some, a lot of inspiration from CalSwap and like how we could maybe improve on it. But it was almost the additional gas cost and complexity of running an auction. We realized like in many cases that almost cancels out any like, like this like marginal extra execution quality that you get. You sometimes like can cancel that out with all of the kind of extra cost of running these crazy auctions. And we realized like that wasn't our specialty. Like, optimizing $1 million order by splitting it into multiple pieces, kind of like 1inch has like this fusion, crazy kind of like, how do you get the absolute best price for really large orders? That was never going to be like our specialty. Like what we understood was like, yeah, like how can we serve the lower end and get like, and a lot of the time, like if someone's doing a $1 NFT, like you don't want to run an auction for this $1 order. Like that is just a waste. And so
You
like
could maybe run
again,
an
like that's
auction
what I
for
was.
the bundle for the whole block. Maybe on an
Yeah, well,
L2, it
that's
doesn't
kind of
make
like
as
a
much sense.
payment for order flow. Like you get kind of exclusive filling for some period, maybe. Like you need to do that. It's like if it's $1 million order, like yeah, for all things, let's run an auction and let's kind of like find the best fill and optimize it.
But I mean,
When you're
maybe
doing
even
these
if you
tiny
see
orders,
the bundle of coincidence of wants, like their bundle establishes a price for each asset on each chain inside of their bundle that gets put on chain all at the same time. So maybe between all of them, even if the orders are smaller, I guess as long as individual solvers are filling each of the orders, then maybe the fees on a $1 transaction on its own, even inside of a bundle that amortizes the gas cost across all users, still isn't attractive. But I see what you're saying. But is that what inspired the move to you just send a regular old 21K gas transaction?
Basically, yeah. I think even CalSwap, like pretty rarely, maybe it's increasing, but the number of coincidence events I think are
Mm,
not actually that common, and it's pretty hard to like achieve the scale where those sorts of things are really common. And the point is, like again, what we've found is a lot of take an application like Zora, they use the minting NFTs. The number one thing for them is that it just works. They want kind of to make sure that it really works. So they're wary of like it getting offered to 100 different fillers, and someone's just random filler. What's their track record? Like, do they have a good DevOps? Are they going to drop the transaction? And so things just like reliability of executing become more important factors at this lower end of the scale. I mean, like it applies across the board where liveness effectively of like I want to make sure this actually goes through, but like the smaller it is, the more you're willing to trade off. Like, I don't care if I get like some tiny percentage better price. I'd much rather just really make sure that it worked and didn't revert and didn't have a refund. And I don't need to run an option across 100 different fillers to see and then give it to the one that has the best price. So I think that goes back to what I was saying again of there's no one perfect system for every order type. And when you're dealing with a large amount, you you're optimizing maybe more for security, you're optimizing more for squeezing out that best bit of execution. When you have lower amounts, you're maybe optimizing for throughput and gas and kind of consistency. And so, yeah, there'll just be different solutions at different ends of the market, I think.
you mentioned when we were chatting earlier, Sorella Labs Intense. What is that about?
Well, this is where you, with Uniswap v4, you are starting to, people can build basically anything on top. And I think what we were talking about is a lot of these intent based systems, even CalSwap, there's kind of a lot of off chain processing that's going on. And then you're just bringing it on chain to settle. And so that's one of the reasons CalSwap can get you a good price is kind of they're running that auction. They're also kind of like effectively trying to capture the MEV and give it back to the user. And Sorella Labs is, I think Angstrom is the name of the DEX. It's not out yet, but the idea is instead of all the AMM trades happening kind of separate, what they do is like they take all the kind of everyone's swaps and they do like the batch where like they kind of just clear everyone at the same price. It's impossible to sandwich attack um, anyone because there's not like I go in first, I push the price up, and someone else goes and pushes the price down. It's just like you take the average across everything, and they do that by basically having this off-chain component. I mean, it's off-chain from the perspective of the AMM. It basically all just looks like one transaction that comes on. That's like boom, I'm gonna. These are all the swaps we're executing, and all the prices that people get, which again is similar to CowSwap. So the point is, I think that there's a lot of similarities between intents and the fact that they're using off-chain liquidity, off-chain like the ability of fillers to watch two chains at once, and kind of do things quickly with this increasing kind of trend towards this like application-specific sequencing and co-processes and yeah, I think it's all kind of in the same direction of how do you reduce MEV, how do you kind of have better execution for users, but kind of coming at it from different angles.
If I can I swap to get native BTC using Relay?
Yes.
Damn, I didn't know that. That's cool. Um,
Yeah, I
how do
mean,
you
kind
support?
of like I
Yeah,
was saying
tell me about it.
earlier, it's just a transfer on chain A, and then a transfer on chain B, and then you need some mechanism to verify that kind of both parties did their end of the bargain. And again, like because we avoid using smart contracts on either the origin or destination, a chain like Bitcoin that doesn't really have smart contracts, you just need some way of combining the transfer with like embedding like a message or a order ID basically into the transfer to kind of prove that I was paying for this order. Um, and and then the rest of the complexity can kind of be from the off-chain perspective of um, validating and agreeing that yes, the Bitcoin transfer was done successfully. So we have Bitcoin and Solana. I think we're going to do Tron soon.
Cool.
Move, all of them. Why not?
So you basically just have to figure out how to integrate it into the arbitration process to be able to prove on chain in order to get the slashing done, or even that part is mostly done off chain currently, so it's not a blocker.
Yeah, yeah. So even the slashing has no concept of Bitcoin, right? So the slashing contract is just okay for a given order. Um, I have some mechanism to kind of check, was this, or like basically ask and, outside Oracle effectively, was this done or not? And if it says it wasn't done, then I'm able to slash. And so, yes, it's like even the adding of something like Bitcoin is purely adding it into this kind of off-chain verification software. And the point is every order between the two users, they're basically agreeing to like, what is the process in which we will arbitrate kind of if something goes wrong. And they're basically saying you have to run verifier version 1.06, and that now has Bitcoin support, and we're agreeing to the kind of terms of how we're interacting, basically.
And um, how will well? I guess you were saying earlier that basically you can turn this into a liquidation game, such that people have to defend their bond or can profit from slashing someone else's bond, such that the data still won't the Bitcoin proof doesn't need to be put on chain, just the sort of result of a gladiatorial match between liquidators and bonded fillers like economically ensures the fulfillment of the thing.
I think what we were talking about is like going back to something I said earlier, which is we try to make the happy case as happy as possible. Um, and where we pay for that is the unhappy case has some complexity, and it kind of sucks for a user if um, they have to go through this arbitration process. How do I use this process? So one of the pieces that we don't have yet, but we want to have, is that someone can almost buy out the user, and they'll go collect the reward from proving the slashing. And the user can almost like it'll just feel like they got refunded effectively, or maybe they even somebody else filled on the other side, and then they go through the process of slashing. So I think the theme is there's always going to be complexity in some way. Um, and I guess you can either like put that complexity into the on-chain contracts, but then maybe you like pay a price in gas and ease of expansion, because now I've got to recreate that logic on every chain. And how do you recreate that logic on Bitcoin? Another way is to kind of shift the complexity to actors in the system. So it'll be harder. There are a lot of reasons why being a filler in our system is harder than being a filler in something like a cross. We also do some things differently where we basically every order is just kind of has an exclusive filler. And and we allow basically the user to push money rather than the filler pulls money from them. And so, long story short, sometimes like the user wants the filler to mint an NFT, but it actually can't be minted. Like
Mm.
the request cannot be filled, and And so in our system, we put the responsibility on the filler to go refund the user, which is a really nice UX. In other systems, the user's money might just sit in the escrow contract and nobody's filling it. And they have to wait for a timeout and then they can go get their money. But in our system, it's like, oh, well, that's a bad experience. How can we basically instantly refund the user as well, which is kind of an underappreciated UX requirement. The point is that being a filler in our system is like actually a
Hard.
lot more work, but that's like a deliberate thing of like how can we shift as much complexity from regular users to these professional fillers, that there's an incentive for them to deal with that complexity and figure it out. And yeah, I also think that you want decentralization of fillers, the main reason being liveness, so that if one filler is down, like the whole thing doesn't stop. But I don't know that you need thousands of fillers. And so that's maybe like another difference of like how many of these do you need? I mean, you look at Ethereum block building where it's down to 2 block builders, and you're like, that's probably not enough. Um, but again, like there's actually, I think, been some research around this where it's like, there's actually, if you've got thousands of fillers, they're all competing for the same orders. There's actually like a cost being paid on every order that I'm not winning. Like I might do the evaluation, I might be running RPC calls and then making my bid and then I lose. Well, I've actually like that cost of my lost bid, I kind of need to like basically make that back and amortize it in like future orders. So like I think there's some middle ground between like you want a set of fillers that are kind of high quality, but do you need thousands of fillers? So this is I think another piece that we'll see play out over time. And it's similar to bundlers, for 4337. As long as you've got the ability to kind of leave one bundler and go to another because it's like a standard. Similar with RPC providers, like some people don't love that everyone's using QuickNode or Infura, but at least there's like a dozen of them that if kind of one is misbehaving, you can go to another versus like, a decentralized RPC network, which like there are nice things about that, but there are probably also downsides about using a fully decentralized RPC network. It's probably not going to be as fast and reliable as QuickNode. So I think that's one of the questions that we think about a lot is like a fill is going to look more like this like fully decentralized network and like bids for every transaction, and where it's going to look more like RPC providers where like maybe more of the flow goes to whoever proves themselves as reliable, and you just want to make sure you can have multiple for liveness. So we'll see how it plays
Is
out.
it competitive right now, the filling game, or is it so difficult that uh, there's not much competition?
There's a bit of competition across all the protocols. I think the numbers are still fairly small. Like you talk to someone like Wintermute, and they're just like they're still sitting on the sideline because the numbers just like aren't even juicy enough
Oh, really?
for them to get involved. I think like just cross chain volume is a lot smaller than
Hmm.
kind of trading volume. Um,
And even within Relay, I guess is it only you who's providing liquidity currently, or is there competition?
yeah, we're still the primary filler, and um, this is something that should change fairly soon. But it's also priority wise, it's one of the pieces that allows us to move quickly. And again, kind of going back to that philosophy of do you need thousands of fillers, or do you just need to make sure that you have a certain number of kind of high quality fillers, and those fillers can't steal your money.
Right.
So we'll see how that plays out. But we certainly kind of on that spectrum kind of have focused on like other pieces, and it's something we'll get to soon. But even when we get there, I think it will, the answer is not, oh, we need thousands of fillers. It's like, how can we ensure that we're not a single point of failure? You have a good kind of variety of fillers.
And do you see anyone like, I mean, maybe Wintermute is like an eventual candidate for doing that work as their market maker, but do you see anyone in the market who is active in a role in another system that will? We kind of touched on this, but Is there a clear like, oh, this person is obviously going to just do this because it benefits their, it gets greater liquidity into their chain, or it's financially beneficial and is suits the skill set that they're qualified to do?
Um, yeah, well, I think there will be like professional fillers that are doing it across chains, that are doing it across protocols. You already see this the same fillers doing many protocols. Um, and but I think another interesting one is like chains themselves or whales on a particular chain where it might not actually be that profitable to fill on that chain, but it greatly enhances the UX of that chain. And so that's kind of like a service you can run effectively is like, let's run a filler for our chain. People can get on and off extremely quickly. Um, and I think it'll get to the point where, so that's kind of, I think, where you'll see a lot of variety. Um, like on any given route, I don't think you want 1,000 people competing for it, but you might actually have 1,000 fillers just by the fact that they're all focused on different routes. And I think you'll have a lot of fillers that are just focused on one route and making that really good. And so that's kind of our focus as well, of like how can we onboard other fillers, not to like maybe necessarily create this like really fierce competition over routes that we're already able to serve, but like unlocking new routes where we don't want to put our we don't have enough capital to put it in all of the places.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think there'll be a mix there, and you almost every chain has kind of like people that are invested in that chain and kind of ready and willing to provide liquidity.
Hmm. Um, you supported Degen Chain very quickly, and then Degen Chain had a 500,000 block reorg. What happened with? I guess I suppose as the primary filler, that probably resulted in some losses, or was it the recipients
Basically, yeah,
that
and I
lost?
think actually this was kind of going back to the different levels of bridge security, right? Like we go fast. Like we usually, as soon as we see the sequencer sign off on something, like we'll go. So in a way, we're like trusting the sequencer of L2s, or if it's like a net, like a decentralized network, like Polygon or Ethereum, like maybe you wait kind of for a few blocks to be confident, like a reorg's not going to happen. And by the way, like there can be reorgs where the transaction just gets replayed. So the risky one is like someone's like really trying to attack it, and like you see their transaction and then they kind of like back out of it. But
Hmm.
yeah, so we go the extreme of speed, right? And then you've got the roll up bridge that's on the other end of the spectrum that waits 7 days, and then you've got other bridges, or these OFTs, these other like token standards, or even CCTP, right? Like these things that kind of go somewhere in the middle. They wait for like the standard level of finalization. So yeah, that was like a 1 day reorg, which is insane. And so not just like intent based systems could get wrecked by that, but like any pool based system or any message based system, like everything can get wrecked by that, except for the highly secure 7 day bridge. And like that's kind of like one of the arguments, why you want that as your core level of security. Um, and and yeah, in the case of like we got wrecked from that, but it's almost like individual actors rather than an existential kind of like all holders of the token got wrecked by that, right? Like if the degen token was like bridgeable by some other thing, then someone could have like exploited that in some way, and minted an insane amount of it, and kind of sold it all. Versus like the token itself um, didn't have risk, but like some of the kind of risk takers on top of the token kind of felt that
Hmm.
risk, and we basically had it go in both directions. In some cases, people paid us. Um, and then we paid them, but our paying of them came back to us, and then sometimes in the opposite direction. And so yeah, these things are possible, but I think they're going to be increasingly rare. Like that's like very much like a growing pain of L2s. I think every RAS
L3s.
provider will be insanely paranoid about these sorts of things. I mean, basically the chain stopped posting routes to Ethereum, and it wasn't noticed for a whole day. And once you go beyond a day, then kind of like the roll up is configured in a certain way where like the contracts on Ethereum will kind of like consider them invalid. So you have to roll back basically to
Oh
continue
wow.
posting new roots, like a too much time elapsed basically.
Hmm.
And so it's plausible that these sorts of things happen, and at the end of the day, that's kind of like built into the model where you're charging a premium for someone to go fast because you are taking on some risk. Um, but at the same time, I think all of the systems are going to get more hardened. We're also kind of working on some of our own monitoring of like, okay, let's make sure um, routes are being posted on all of the rollups that we're operating on. So I think it should become less common over time.
Hmm. Does it affect how you think about liquidity providing these filling wallets on different chains? I mean, because you could get into a very bad situation if that were to happen again, but it was on a more popular chain. It could put you deeply in the red. No, to if it was even more popular than Degen. But I guess you're saying it's not gonna. It seems less and less likely because people are more and more conservative about this kind of thing. But
Yes. I think it might be breaking up a little bit here, but
oh, I guess I can repeat my question a little bit. It's like just is does the experience of the
yeah, I
degen
think
thing change how you
basically
consider the risk for your own LPing?
another way to is to just contain the risk, right? And just limit how much you have on every chain.
I guess there's a little delay.
Okay, are we back?
I think we're back. I don't know. I think there's a little bit of latency on our line. But we have been talking for an hour and a half, so perhaps it's a good time to call it in any case. Um, Peter, this was super interesting, and I love Relay, and I'm very excited to see what designs you come up with next. I feel everything you've done, the Reservoir and Relay, both, at least as far as I know them, and Sora integrations, etc., all expresses a great degree of taste and high quality user experience that's always surprising and delightful. So it's nice to have you on the show. Thank you for coming and talking so much about Relay. It's been a pleasure learning about it.
Thanks for having me, and a lot cooking still. So we're just getting started. I'll
Where
see
should
you in a
people
year
keep
for the
up with you?
next for
Yeah,
round three.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah, was it July 2023 was our last call. Where do you hang out online? What do you pay attention to around crypto in your sort of personal life?
I'm definitely more of a Twitter than a Farcaster. I notice you're on the Purple app these days.
A lot, yeah.
But yeah, I still think I'm pretty regular on Twitter, and yeah, we didn't get too deep into it, but I think there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff around the resource locks, a lot of interesting stuff around, yeah, like I think the resource locks is kind of that we're we're starting to get ready for more of the chain abstraction, um, and things like 7702, lots of interesting kind of angles
But so there
coming.
you're saying
Um,
7702 to me is like transforms MetaMask, the MetaMask user base into smart accounts. And then once they have smart accounts, they have access to the chain abstraction world provided by intent-based credible machines. Is that the drift of it?
kind of, yeah. I mean, in some ways they're like separate things, but the point you made of like, oh, what if I'm minting the NFT and there's a whitelist, right? So again, like that can break the illusion of chain abstraction. And so like for chain abstraction to work, you need to maintain the illusion. And so some of the things are it's too slow or expensive. As I'm doing things, the illusion breaks, or I'm unable to take action A because that requires authentication,
Mm,
and a filler can't do that on my behalf. So you need these
I
pieces to
see what you're
fall
saying.
in place to be able to maintain the illusion, basically. And we're getting there. So 7702 is actually kind of separate to resource locks, and ironically, the way they did it kind of makes it a little bit incompatible with
Oh,
resource locks because the EOA can override, so
so
you
they're
can
not
turn
credible
your EOA
commitments.
into a smart account, but like the EOA remains as like a pseudo key. So it just means it's harder for that smart account to give these credible guarantees because the EOA can equivocate
And it
basically.
can't relinquish those privileges, the EOA.
You cannot relinquish. Yeah, it's a big
Hmm.
big debate. There's pros and cons of that. But I think the resource locks work best as an opt-in, or a new person just like goes into resource locks. So they go into a smart account from day one into, they're holding ETH and USDC. They don't realize it's resource locked, but the whole account is resource locked. Um, but you don't have to use resource locks to get chain abstraction. So like resource locks is cool. It allows you to go instant, but you can get pretty close to instant without resource locks, and that's kind of Relay's whole thing. And so there's a ton you can do on kind of chain abstraction and UX without resource locks, although they do make it better. So anyway, a lot of these things are converging,
So
and
for example, you might solve the breaking of the illusion of an allow list on a destination chain or a token gating, something that requires that the transaction emanate from the user's own address on some other chain. You might have the filler deploy the smart account for them, such as a 7702 upgrade on the destination chain, and then
and then make
execute the transaction as a user operation from that address to maintain the illusion. And they would still
yeah.
retain their EOA access to the address on the destination chain.
Yeah, and this is without resource locks. So there was, because a lot of chain abstraction is kind of just an off-chain thing. So instead of presenting you as saying you have ETH on base, it just says you have ETH, and then it's like, oh, and here's an app on Arbitrum, and they want to use it, or they would just spend their ETH and use the app, and they wouldn't need to know that they're holding their asset on a different chain. It doesn't need to be in a resource lock. The filler could execute the action on Arbitrum. It could be via 7702 coming from them. They might buy an asset now on Arbitrum, but the wallet or application just shows that they've got ETH and this new asset, and they say, I want to sell the asset. And again, a filler might help them be taking these actions across chains, but it can be fully abstracted. So you can build a chain abstracted experience without resource locks. Resource locks kind of like reduce the latency a little bit, and they reduce the
Hmm.
risk for solvers, which kind of maybe makes solvers more willing to go really fast.
Hmm.
But most of the time, solvers are just going fast despite the risk. And maybe that will change if there are more blowups like TGen. But there's higher risk tolerance right now. And so I think resource locks are really powerful, and they're a better way to do it, but we can kind of start to experiment with it
It's
pre.
interesting because the experience of using Relay Link, you're like, oh, am I taking on a lot of risk? This seems really easy. And then actually, it's like, no, the fillers are taking on a
The
lot of
filler is
risk.
taking on a lot of risk. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
And so again, like that's shift risk, shift complexity to these professional actors as much as possible is kind of the theme.
very cool. Peter, thanks so much. I look forward to talking again in a year, and good luck with Relay Protocol.
Thanks a lot. Catch you later.
See you.